It has been an interesting week. Many things going on. Some reasons for us to shed tears and to spend some time on our knees in prayer. Also some reasons for us to rejoice. Well, why should this week be like any other, right? It's the way life is. As we look, though, at what life brings our way, one question that we should probably ask ourselves is, how well are we doing? As I mentioned earlier, Pauline did life well. Not all of us maybe have or feel that we have done that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul writes to the Corinthian church. His encouragement to them is that they hold fast to what it is they've been called to. In chapter 9, beginning in verse 24, he says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Now, as Paul makes these points, he reminds the Corinthian church that there is a responsibility that we have to stay faithful to our Lord and to what he has called us to in life, lest we find ourselves disqualified. Because if the apostle can find himself to be disqualified after all the work he has done, how much more those of us who are not apostles? In fact, Paul makes it pretty clear that his qualification for life with Christ does not stem from his work. Because he says, even after preaching to others, Paul established churches and helped grow those that had been established by others. Paul gave up much of his livelihood to travel around the world planting seeds for Jesus. Paul subjected himself to ridicule and stoning and imprisonment and whipping, and ultimately death, all for the cause of Christ. And yet he makes this point that if I don't do right, if I don't stay faithful, if I don't run the race well, that even after preaching, after doing all these wonderful things that I have done for Jesus, I might be disqualified. So being faithful and running the race is not just about works. It's not about the things that we will do. So what is it that disqualifies us? It's us. It is the things that we will not do, or the things that we do that we shouldn't do. It is our lack of being faithful to running the race well. One of the things that gets to us is that sometimes we make a false start. You've probably seen races where someone has done that. I ran track once. Well, for a year, one season. I ran more than one time. But, I've seen that happen. Sometimes we might do that in life. Jesus told Nicodemus in John 3:7, do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. There are a lot of people out there that wear the name Christian that really haven't been born again. They haven't changed from their previous life. They go on living exactly the way they always have. The only difference is that they now call themselves Christian. And maybe they go to church. Maybe they go to church regularly. But they haven't changed. You see, one of the things about being born again is that you are something new. You're not the old you. And yet there are those who call themselves Christians who make a false start. They love to think that they're Christians. Maybe they've even gone underwater. But if they have not repented, and if their lives have not changed, then they haven't been reborn. Jesus would say in Mark chapter 2, verse 22, "No one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins." Jesus was making the point in the context here that you can't hold on to the old. Jesus' teaching was not just an expansion of the old law. Jesus was not just here as another rabbi telling people how they should live their lives to be pleasing to God within the confines of the law of Moses. That's the old wineskin. And when Jesus brings his new wine, something that offers true healing from our sinful nature, that won't fit. If you try to put that into the old wineskins, you end up just breaking the wineskins and losing the wine. And yet there were many people that were listening to Jesus that's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to shoehorn Christ into the law of Moses, trying to make him fit their worldview. Even those who honestly believed that Jesus was the Messiah he claimed to be had this idea that his was a political role, not a spiritual role, and they tried to make him fit into what they wanted rather than accepting Jesus on his terms. They wanted to follow Christ, but they got off to the wrong start, because they didn't understand Christ for who he was, and they did not accept him under his terms. So making a false start is one of the things that can get us disqualified. The problem with a false start is that oftentimes we think we're fine. We may not even realize that we're lost. We just keep on going along and doing the same old thing we've always done. And as long as we go to church and call ourselves a Christian, God should be okay with that. Another reason that we might find ourselves disqualified is because we fail to follow the rules. Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:5, "An athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules." That's pretty straightforward. And again, we know this. We see what happens when you don't follow the rules in a game, whatever that game may be. Let me tell you now, you don't want to play Monopoly with my wife as the banker. She's from Louisiana, and they have different rules. Among them, making loans to your friends while cutting off your enemies. Very nepotism thing going on there. So don't play with her. But we got to follow the rules if we're going to win. For example, John would write to his readers in 1 John chapter 3, beginning in verse 23, "And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he commanded us. Whoever keeps his commandments abides in God, and God in him. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit whom he has given us." while we are no longer under the old law, while Jesus did not come to simply give us an addendum to the old law and still hold us to Judaism, he still has commandments. He still has requirements of us. And while we cannot do those things in order to earn our salvation, by not doing those things, we prove that in our hearts we don't really love God enough to do what he says. And that's really what it boils down to. Are we following God? If you are choosing to do your own thing, then you are following you. And that indicates that the only God in your life is you. You might claim to be godly. You might like to think that you're following God. But anytime something comes up that God said that you don't agree with, if you say, well, I'm just going to do it this way because God really wasn't thinking of this situation when he made that rule, then you are in fact setting yourself up as God. That has been man's problem from the beginning. Didn't Satan tell Eve in the garden, you will be like God, knowing good and evil? And she thought, that's a good idea. And Adam went along with it. And sin entered the world because man wanted to be God. And we struggle with that to this day. If we don't follow the rules, we write the rules as we go along, then we're not really interested in what God has to say. Only if it happens to support what we already want to do, that's fine. But we have to follow the rules in order to not be disqualified. The third thing that we might note in order to become disqualified is we might not train. We don't properly train. If you're an athlete, you got to train. If you're a musician, you got to practice. Whatever you do in life, if you're going to do it well, you have to do it often enough to do it well. I had a voice teacher who once told me that the difference between an amateur and a professional is that an amateur practices until he gets it right. A professional practices until he can't get it wrong. How are we when it comes to practicing our faith? How are we when it comes to being trained in godliness? The Hebrew author writes in Hebrews 12, verse 11, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And that's kind of the key, isn't it? Those of you who have had children or have children have disciplined them. And you discipline them because you love them and you want them to learn something. You want them to be a better person than they were before. And that's never fun. It's not fun for the child, and it's not fun for the parent either. We don't like to discipline. I'm the kind of person, I'm not into confrontation. I don't care to discipline my kids. But if I love them, I'm going to do that. And God will be the same way with us. When we need it, he disciplines us because he loves us and he wants us to learn something. And that is what this whole verse is about. If we are trained by those disciplining circumstances, then we go away a better person than we started. We can also spend our own time training ourselves so that we don't get into those situations where we need to have God's discipline. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, which some of you probably know by heart, Paul wrote to Timothy, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. We spend time in the Word getting to know what God wants us to be, what God requires of us. We spend time in prayer, taking our concerns and our desires to know and to become more wise to God. And he hears our prayer and answers. And that is part of the training that we must go through. In Mark chapter 9, there's a story where Jesus heals a boy who has an unclean spirit. Starting in verse 25, we read, "And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, 'You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again.' And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out. And the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, 'He is dead.' But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, 'Why could we not cast it out?'" You see, Jesus had been with Peter, James, and John on the mountain where he had been transfigured. And when he came down from the mountain, from that experience, here the people are quarreling with the apostles, with Jesus' disciples, because they're trying to cast out a spirit and it won't go. And Jesus responds in verse 29, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." Now, in Matthew's account of this, in Matthew chapter 17, Jesus says that this kind can't be driven out without prayer and fasting. These are disciplines. These are things that we do in order to help us be more spiritual. That doesn't mean we literally beat our bodies. There are a group of people who do that, thinking that that's what Paul is talking about. But any athlete can tell you that while you may not literally beat your body, you work it. You work it hard. I still can't think of this verse. Well, the verse in our 2 Corinthians that we're using as our text. I can't help but think of that, and I think of Rocky IV. You remember Dolph Lundgren, and Rocky's got to get back to basics. He's been soft. So he gets in there, and he's in that barn doing sit-ups from hanging upside down, which just hurts me to think about. And he's getting his body ready for the task at hand. Paul says that's what we need to do with our spiritual lives. We need to get them ready for the task at hand. Jesus says that disciplines like prayer and fasting are important. And while I may not be casting out any demons, that's still important for me to have the right relationship I need to have with God. Fourth thing that we sometimes do is we lose sight of the goal. Maybe we started well, and maybe we did well for a while, but then we lose sight of the goal. We start going the wrong way. I was in a basketball game once where somebody did that. One of our guys got the ball, and he started dribbling to the other team's basket. Fortunately, he was lousy at layups because there was nobody on that end of the court to oppose him. And I think even if there had been, we all just stopped and looked at him with our jaws hanging open. What are you doing? We lose sight of the goal. We go the wrong way, or we get off the track. In Luke chapter 9, verse 24, Jesus says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it." Our priorities need to be right. Part of keeping our eyes on the goal is having the correct priorities. And if our priority is doing what pleases God rather than what pleases self, then we're on the right track. But anytime we want to hold on to self, we risk letting go of what matters, what's eternal. We have to let go of self and hold on to God. Again, the Hebrew writer says in chapter 12 of that book, but in the first couple of verses, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The Hebrew writer points out that we have a goal. We have one that we are to be looking at, and not to be distracted by the things of this world. Jesus is our focus. What he did is our goal, and we are moving toward that. That is the ultimate prize in the race. Paul said, run so you can win the prize. A fifth reason that we might become disqualified is that we quit. We just give up. Prematurely, we just give up. Paul wrote to Timothy as he was nearing the end of his life in 2 Timothy 4:7, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Would that every one of us could say that. When we get to the end of our lives and we look back, did Paul have things that he could have regretted? Absolutely. Did he have things that he did wrong that he might have liked to have changed had he could? Absolutely. Every one of us can be in that boat. But Paul looked back on his life, and he didn't focus on the things that he could have done or shouldn't have done, but he focused on the race that he ran. He focused on the faith that he held fast to. The could-haves and shouldn't-haves aren't what matter. His trust in Jesus is what mattered. Just as Jesus trusted his Father. John records in John 19:30, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Jesus saw God's plan all the way through to the end. Don't for a moment think it was easy for him. That's why he was in the garden praying that God might do something else, praying that if it was possible, this cup of anguish would pass from Jesus so that he wouldn't have to go through what he went through. If it had been easy to go to the cross, that prayer was meaningless. It was not an easy decision. But Jesus had said to his listeners, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. When Jesus took on the responsibility to save us from our sin, he did not look back. John would tell us that when it came time for him to die, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. He knew what the outcome would be, and yet he determined that he was going to go there and go through with it. That is our model. That is our pattern. Jesus would not leave the work of God undone, even though it meant losing his own life, even though it meant losing a relationship with God when he became sin in the flesh and God turned his back on him. In spite of the pain, both physical and spiritual, that he went through to the end. we're called to no less. It's really easy sometimes to grow weary, particularly when it has been a long time and there seems to be no end in sight. And when we grow weary, we might decide to throw in the towel and give up. There's no point in pressing further. Perhaps that's why the book of Revelation was written, so that we can look at that and we can see how the story ends. We don't have to wait for that to happen. We can see it now. And because we know how the story ends, and we know how God vanquishes all evil, we continue to press against the evil. It does not ultimately win. It is not ultimately victorious. Our faith is victorious. And with that, we won't be disqualified. We run like we're going to win, even if it seems we're losing. Because it's not about being first past the line. It's about staying the course and living well, running the race well. I don't know that anybody here right now is particularly in need of this lesson. Although to me it seemed important to say, so maybe someone does need to hear that. If that's you, it is my prayer that you will consider how you are doing, how you're running the race. And if this morning you need to make that right with God, please don't leave this building until you've done so. That might just be a personal prayer between you and the Lord. Or it might be something where you desire the prayers of the congregation. Whatever need you have this morning, please deal with that this morning. And you can do so while we stand and sing.